We've put together a fantastic panel of visionaries working on the front lines of public libraries and cities to share with you their vision for where the public library is going. The panel is moderated by just the perfect person. Atlantic Magazine and their sister site Atlantic Cities has been doing a fantastic job covering the issues of the evolving library and the library of the future. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Sommer Mathis, the editor of Atlantic Cities, who will be your moderator and host for this morning's conversation. Sommer.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for breakfast. So we are here to talk about the Public Library Reimagined, which I think is a really apt description because libraries all over the country and indeed the world are in the midst of a pretty remarkable transformation. Gone are the days when libraries can afford to be mere repositories of things or even just of information. So my name is Sommer Mathis. We've actually recently rebranded the Atlantic Cities, and so I'm now editor of CityLab.com. But that is the Atlantic sister site dedicated to the most pressing issues facing today's cities and neighborhoods. So joining me today to help us all understand exactly how and why what public libraries are transforming. Immediately next to me is Brian Bannon. He was the commissioner of the Chicago Public Library. Before moving to Chicago, Brian was the chief information officer for the San Francisco Public Library, where he managed digital strategy, information, public media, and online services. Next, we have Tessie Guillermo, who is president and CEO of ZeroDivide, an organization that aims to help communities bridge the digital divide and transform themselves through technology. And finally, we have John Palfrey, president of the board of directors of the Digital Public Library of America, a trustee at the Knight Foundation, and when he's not busy researching and teaching on new media and learning, he serves as head of school at Phillips Academy, Andover. So please join me in welcoming our panel, and thank you for coming. So we all know that we're living in an age when consumers can download entire collections of books and periodicals in seconds. And yet, a few months ago, the Pew Research Center found that more than 2/3 of Americans say that they are engaged with their public libraries. Earlier this month, the Institute for Museum and Library Services found that attendance at library programs have increased more than 30% nationwide since 2004. So it's maybe not the most intuitive time as we're moving fast into the digital age and really solidifying what all that means. People are using libraries more than ever. So what's going on here? Are libraries shifting permanently away from being collections of books and toward something more like a community center? Brian, what's happening in Chicago?
Well, I think that I'm glad you started with that question, and there's something wonderful about libraries in that books are associated with libraries in such a strong and positive way. It's also one of the great liabilities, particularly our public libraries, because our missions are so much bigger than a format, and books, as much as we all love them, are our format for sharing and distributing knowledge. And I think that libraries, our core mission hasn't changed. And in fact, the way that we've been behaving as anchor institutions, centers of learning, has been pretty consistent. And Chicago Public Library is 140 years old. And we've been sort of performing against that mission in pretty interesting and radical ways over that 140-year period. So in some ways, if we really look at history, libraries, in my view, are one of the great sort of innovation stories that we don't talk about. That how many institutions do we know today that are 140 years old that are experiencing record-breaking use, and that record-breaking use is consistent over time. So we've seen this big upswing. So there's something that libraries are doing right, but they've known how to do it for a long time. And so I think what we're doing in Chicago is just continuing to expand and advance our mission. We're just doing it in different ways, and I'll give you a few examples later.
Okay, great. And Tessie, in your work with your clients and library clients, what are you seeing?
So I was fortunate to be one of the participants on the Aspen dialogue last year on the public libraries. And the themes that sort of emerged from that dialogue really relate very much to what I sort of encounter in the work that we do with communities, particularly underserved communities. Those are the themes of people, place, and platform. And so to the extent that the mission of libraries hasn't changed, the ability to sort of rally around these themes of people, not just the librarians, but the patrons that come, place, the rooting of libraries in community, in place, really sort of as an anchor institution that has access to and provides access to all of the other sort of essential services and activities that are going on in place. And then platform, and I think that's probably one of the things that's more emergent in the notion of libraries. Platform where now, as a central entity, both physically and virtually, you're gathering up sort of a network of people in different places, doing different things that now have a common platform from a virtual standpoint, but also from a physical standpoint. They can come together and do lots of different things, really sort of do this innovation work, but also just do basic community building, basic learning together. And that, I think, really allows for the library to become very agile and flexible and continue its growth and its value.
John?
I agree totally with Brian's historical take, and I totally agree with Tessie's theoretical take. I have to say I'm not quite as sanguine, though, maybe, as those responses would suggest. I happen to believe that libraries are more important in a digital age than they were prior. I think actually the importance of libraries continues to grow. The importance of public libraries continues to grow for reasons that we can talk about. But I actually worry that if what we do is rely on what Brian is describing, this sort of sense of nostalgia for the books and the must and all of that, I actually think that the support for public libraries could erode. And I think actually if they turn into community centers, that would be a bad thing. So I think there's work to be done in this reframing, and I think there's really urgent and important things that we can and should do.
Why would you think it would be a bad thing for them to become community centers?
Well, I think if you imagine what a community center just in the strict sense would be, which is considered kind of an open space with some people who help do programming, that could mean anything to a community. I think public libraries mean something very specific to communities, that it is grounded in ideas, it's grounded in knowledge, it's grounded in job creation, it's grounded in what kids need after school, it's grounded in what an immigrant might need to find their way into a new country. I think there are a bounded and important series of things that happen. I also think it's tied to the cultural and historical record of the place. And I think if it ended up just being sort of anodyne community centers, you would have A, no librarians, right? That sort of implies that it's not professionals who are guiding this process. And B, I think it wouldn't actually be as specific and as focused toward these things that in a democracy we need libraries to do.
Brian, do you think that that conflicts with what your idea is of what the job of a librarian is?
No, I mean, actually, I would agree with John that when I think of libraries as a community center, community space, and I'm glad, actually, that's interesting. I haven't heard someone have that such a strong.
Good, I'm trying to compare.
Yeah. No, it's great because I think that when I think about a library as a community space, I think about it in the ways that you just described. In Chicago, we're the largest provider of free homework help in the city. We're the largest provider of open and free access to technology in the city. Obviously, we lend books, and there's so many other things that we're doing related to supporting new Americans, supporting jobs, and helping the economy of the city. But we do it through the lens of library, and we do it through the lens of our mission. And it starts with this idea that everyone, regardless of who they are or their background, should have free and open access to the leading ideas of the day. And I think that's where we start with libraries, and then we begin to think about where is our community today, and how do we perform against that broad aspirational goal. In some cases, we're looking at how we support learning in very specific ways, how we support the economy and jobs, and finding jobs and building business in a specific way, and then others, how we make a community stronger through performing democracy. But you're right, it isn't sort of a conventional term. The word community center might conjure a very different idea in someone's mind if they don't truly understand the core mission of a library.
Here's an example, concrete of library as, I don't know if as community center, but really more as central, right, to an emerging set of issues or emerging knowledge base that needs to be shared across the community. So my organization has been working with Web Junction content pusher to libraries around the enrollment of people in the Affordable Care Act. And so to the extent that you have people who are now eligible to become part of the healthcare delivery system as a consumer, but who have never done so before, right? They need to enroll. Many don't have computers in their home, and so they're going to the library to do the enrollment. They don't have insurance literacy, so they don't know what it means to sign up for insurance, that it's not just a matter of signing up, that you actually have to provide a lot of information, and the kind of information that you have to provide determines the kind of, in many ways, the coverage that you're going to get. Once you actually enroll and you choose your plan and you get to see the doctor, you find out you might have diabetes or some other health problem. Coming back to the library to have that information curated for you, right, with the librarian who is a professional at helping you learn that, and then to understand where in the community might you go to sign up for a class to improve your health condition. So that's more than a community center, but it does still reflect what the library very specifically can do, and as both a historical service, but maybe new content and new ways of doing it.
Maybe one way to reframe it would be to say libraries should be the center of communities, but not be community centers in the sense of of what we imagine that would be.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating actually, because the Affordable Care Act is a really good example of something that's incredibly complicated that people really had a hard time navigating. But I wouldn't necessarily have thought of a librarian as the right person to help navigate the exchanges for someone who's trying, They were trying to have the people out in the community who really understood health insurance, and I wouldn't necessarily have guessed a librarian would be a good place to start. Well, let's talk a little bit about what specific kinds of programming we're really talking about. We're talking about a rise in attendance at programming at libraries, but what kinds of services and programming are libraries providing now that they didn't before, or that are becoming more popular that they did provide before? And why are libraries the right place to host those kinds of community services?
Well, I actually think that our more traditional programs are also on the right. So like our book discussion groups, author events. People are reading more today than in different points in our history, and they're reading in lots of different formats. And I think the libraries has been a great convener of those conversations. And so we actually see more demand than we've seen previously in sort of traditional. But on the other side, we're as the world of information changes, we found that sometimes an author talk without format isn't the most effective way of sharing ideas. And we've started to experiment with different, facilitating learning through experience. And one example is it was a short-term project in Chicago where we wanted to explore the questions around advanced manufacturing as it relates to the city wanting to sort of think about being a leader in manufacturing. So we opened a lab where you can 3D print, explore, seeing various different pieces of advanced manufacturing. And what we were surprised by is there was a big community that immediately sort of showed up at the library that had been using us before, and it was a really effective way of exposing people to those technologies that are very hard to describe in any other way other than doing. And so increasingly we're looking at ways in the library of how we can expose people to leading ideas through experience and programs like that, as opposed to just more traditional ways of exposing people through print.
Sommer, may I ask a question of my
Please,
fellow panelists? Yeah. Brian, I saw your awesome innovation lab, which I assume is that one up by the main entrance where it looked like it had 3D printers and so forth in it. Would you imagine that you'll have 3D printers in there perpetually, or is the idea that you will always have what is the new edge of some form of innovation in there? I'm
glad you asked that, because actually the lab concept is really intended to experiment with various different approaches. So it's the project actually has been extended, but we hadn't intended for it to be. It was supposed to be a 6-month experiment. We do not believe that Chicago Public Library's role is to be the 3D printing hub for the city. In fact, we think the private sector will do that. But we think it's an interesting place for people to be exposed to this technology that many believe is a game changer in so many different industries. We think it's possible that on our public computers, since we have the largest footprint of public access in the city, that we may want to be put on our basic offerings some of these 3D software programs. But no, we actually don't want the lab to continue in that function. In fact, we've already started to do lab projects related to data visualization and big data to help people understand what's available and how to adapt and use those data. So we have a whole laundry list of lab projects. And actually, this is actually taking a note from Franklin that he's noted with one of the early concepts of American public libraries where you sort of take your private libraries and make them available to a larger group through the subscription model. And when he did that, actually what many people don't know is that in addition to having all of those collections, he was also doing experiments. And so he was experimenting with electricity and various different leading technologies of the day right there in the library. And we think that, at least in Chicago, that's an interesting place for the library to be, is to expose people to these leading technologies, these new ways of learning, but doing it in an experimental way.
Yeah, I think the libraries of the future, it's hard to talk about them sort of separately from how you talk about what places in the future are going to be like. Whether it be in cities or in rural areas or whatever, so that the library's institution, schools as institutions, zoos as institutions, museums as institutions, they're all changing, right? And so I think there's going to be a lot of iteration as we move towards the future about what might the library, any of these institutions be, and what role they play in the way that residents and community members organize themselves or take advantage of the kinds of services that institutions provide. It was interesting, I was at a session yesterday, who will determine the marketplace of the future, and there was a lot of joking about librarians, which was really interesting because some of the panel members were talking about how sort of algorithm is the king or a queen, right? Really the only way to get anything done right, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, right, is to really query through an algorithm. And librarians can't be an algorithm, right? But that's the beauty of it, right? Because the intersection of the analytics that come from algorithm and the humanness that comes from a person that's really going to make sense of that for you is, I think, the most important thing to think about in terms of libraries of the future or any institution of the future.
A few months ago, I had the opportunity to interview one of your colleagues, John Sabo, who's the head of the Los Angeles Public Library System, and one of the programs that they're launching there is a high school. They're creating an accredited high school diploma program inside the library, which is something he had come from the Atlanta Fulton County Library System, where they had a lot of success with librarians helping GED students complete their GEDs. And so in Los Angeles, he's taking that one step further and actually turning it into a fully accredited high school where you get a real diploma. And so those are some of the kinds of programs that I'm seeing libraries create where he was talking about how the way that he was able to sell this is that basically in Atlanta, they had on from maybe 100 GED completions per year to over 550. And the argument there, when you're in a space where there's a funding crunch, being able to tell the county commissioners, we've basically given you an entire high school here. Over 550 graduates, it amounts to an entire high school. So those are some of the kinds of things that I'm hearing about from library systems where they are trying to innovate. So I guess I was just curious to hear any other really innovative programming that you guys are hearing about as well. Nothing. Okay.
I'm curious what you think as the leader of a high school.
I'm still thinking about the high school thing.
Yeah.
Helping students finish their diploma in the sense of a GED makes perfect sense for libraries. As somebody who runs a high school, there's a whole lot that goes into the education of kids from whatever age, 13 or 14
This is mostly
to
for adult learners.
No, I follow.
Yeah.
But it's so much goes into the care, and obviously in my case it's a very expensive private high school and so forth, so it's more elaborate, and this has got a very different mission. But that's certainly pushing the edge of what libraries ought to do, is actually run a high school. Certainly the completion part makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah.
I guess I like the models where libraries are connecting to forms of learning that are happening for kids, so that there's a theory that I'm partial to of connected learning, and it's something that's being used greatly in Chicago Public Library as an example in their U-Media space, where you've got kids have a school and they have other places that they do their primary learning, but they connect very effectively into spaces that the library has that attracts them there, and noting that a lot of the learning kids are doing is informal, and it's in interstitial moments on these devices. And if librarians can be a part of that process, I think that can save kids' lives, literally. Actually, running a high school start to finish, I'll have to look more into whether that makes all that much sense from my perspective.
Well, I think the idea, and maybe you'll agree more with this, is that the actual learning is taking place online, but the library is there to help make those connections to the online learning experience.
I totally get that, and actually the idea of having hybrid spaces and learning spaces where you're connecting in real space to what's going on online, I think is a great model. I just think that at least when you think of what you're trying to accomplish in high school, particularly for kids of an age, it's so much about moral and the kind of connections that kids are making to one another. And it seems that if librarians want to take that on and actually play that role, it could work. It's just probably not exactly what most librarians have trained themselves to do. And I would think it's actually in a way trickier with adult learners of various ages than it is as compared to kids. But maybe the point is I'm having the perfect be the enemy of the good in my head, and that this is a great thing for a bunch of people, so go for it.
I have a sort of a question as well. So John, you mentioned John Sabin. One of the things that he's doing also in Los Angeles is working on, with community organizations and with the city on citizenship.
Yes.
Services. And part of it is because of the need and the population that is in Los Angeles. And part of it, I think, is as I understand it from other people, maybe not from John himself, but the need for libraries to find other ways of supporting themselves, right?
Exactly.
And so maybe some of the new services and some of the new models and the innovation has to do with, yes, there is an increase in the use of libraries, but I don't know if there's a parallel increase in the support, the financial support for libraries. And so libraries have to start looking at new models for revenue and
not just revenue, I would
right.
say, but quantifying their impacts on the
Right.
community.
Right.
That was one of the things that John and I talked about, was that those kinds of numbers that politicians really like numbers like that. When you can go and say, here's what I did, and it equaled this number of people that
Sommer, you're sitting
helped.
next to one of the great success stories of this in the country, and Bannon, who has turned the city of Chicago around in this way, right? You've found a way to really align what you're doing with the city's mission and have a great story there.
Yeah, I think that we actually worked with mission measurement, which I think is in the house, to help us do that. We spent some time looking at sort of the core mission of the library, and while our mission hasn't changed, we thought it was important to be using the library to make the city stronger. And I think that's really what libraries are, public libraries are about, fundamentally access and helping people connect, to perform democracy, but we're also about making our cities smarter, more competitive, and hopefully sustainable. And that's really how we realigned the libraries, to look at the 3 different areas that were most important to the city, and figure out how the library against our mission can help the city stronger. So we looked at learning, supporting the economic ecosystem, as well as strengthening our neighborhood assets, our neighborhoods, in the city. Back to your question on what libraries are doing sort of in the experimental places. One of the things I think many people don't realize is in this connected world how few people are actually connected. So we've got a large portion of us, I'm sure everybody in this room, has multiple devices that are connecting to the internet. Lots of opportunities to, to email, to learn, to use all these great tools. But there is still a large portion of people in the U.S. that don't have it. And in Chicago, we have certain neighborhoods where 70% of the people have limited or no access to the leading knowledge of the day, and they can't apply for jobs, they can't get benefits. And so the library has a really important role in that space. And so actually one of the things that we're experimenting with in Chicago is how we can begin to help people bring the internet home, and also be exposed to some of the free and low-cost programs that would allow them to sustain that activity. So we'll be launching later this year a program that allows you to check out devices, so hotspots plus a laptop, so you can begin to take those things home. But in that case, it's less about the technology and actually more about the support that we're providing to people to understand what the programs out there that exist to help them sustain it, how to help them build the skills they need, and then to help them bring it home so they can experiment at home.
So we actually ran a story about this. So both the Chicago Public Library and the New York Public Library have just recently received grants from, I believe it's the Knight Foundation, to launch these Wi-Fi lending.
It's the prestigious news challenge that they both won.
Yes, exactly. And I thought I was fascinated by this, and I'm glad to hear you say that the plan in Chicago is to add to, it's not just here's your Wi-Fi hotspot and go take it home for however long. Yeah. How long will people be able to check those out for?
It's 3 weeks, and I think in New York they're lending them for multiple months, so they're sort of giving them the service. Again, this is a pilot, this is an experiment. It's something for us to learn and hopefully adapt. And we don't know if it'll be the right approach. What I do think is interesting about the hotspot lending program, and actually many of the things that hit the press, which you are, is it's often sort of the shiny objects that are coming out on the other end. And I think in Chicago, many of the things that we've been acknowledged for doing are experiments. They're not they're not services that we've committed to. They're not things that we necessarily want to do in the long term, but it's representing sort of our research and development, which is a tiny amount of the effort of our organization. But it's interesting, and I actually think it's the case in the city, is that buzz, it turns out, is important to elevating your brand while you're actually doing the more tested work at the community level, which we often don't get as much publicity for.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess my big question about the long-term viability of lending out hotspots for an average library, say a smaller library system in a smaller town, is whether that's really going to be affordable within the constraints of a library budget in the long term.
Well, our hope in this particular case is that it can bring, one of our hopes is that as we start looking at E-rate reform, which is a program that allows schools and libraries to submit for significant reimbursements for technology, that this could be something that would qualify as part of the E-rate reform, which we would then get a 90% discount, and it would be scalable.
Yeah.
And Sommer, I think one of the assumptions, though, is that libraries would continue doing everything they've been doing, plus lend out hotspots. I think the point is there will have to be some of these trade-offs.
Yeah.
And one might say, reasonably, that having every place make the same physical collection of books in every relevant town, or with relevant cities next to one another, Minneapolis and St. Paul or whatever, they may have to purchase less, right? And maybe the value of giving somebody a hotspot is so much greater than having the marginal works. Now, that's a controversial thing to say. It means libraries spend less from their collection budget on physical objects, which might not be good for the publishing industry, might have other kind of ripple effects. But I do think those are the kinds of trade-offs as we make this switch from a predominantly analog world to a predominantly digital world that we will have to do.
Well, and that's interesting, too, the idea that library systems would need to collaborate that are maybe geographically near each other, which isn't, maybe sometimes work in the case of the Twin Cities, they have a pretty good relationship, but in other regional systems of governments, that might be pretty complicated.
So, one of the things, I'm glad you brought that point up about the trade-offs, and particularly as we're moving into the digital realm, is that our model for sharing knowledge is changing dramatically as a result of the law. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about for libraries, our ability to lend physical objects, so books, versus lending digital materials. It's actually very expensive, and in some cases that knowledge or that content in some ways isn't even available. And so we are having to make decisions and trade-offs about what we buy in print versus what we buy digital. And as we increasingly move into digital, one of the big questions about the future of libraries is, will we have the ability to procure and then share the leading ideas of the day? And the answer may be no.
I think the key distinction is in a physical era, we have the first sale doctrine under the copyright law, so you can take a physical book that you purchase and you can do anything you want with it. You can resell it at a secondhand bookstore, you can tear it up, you could put it on fire, you could lend it like a library or whatever. And in the digital era, there is no digital for sale doctrine. So it doesn't exist. So when a library takes things in, they're taking it in according to a contract, and that's where the publishers are saying, 26 lens or 52 lens or whatever they're suggesting. And if libraries become, instead of owners of materials, they're becoming renters or leasers of materials according to a set of contractual terms that don't include holding it forever and lending it out, libraries obviously are in a less good position. And I think that's a huge and big concern going forward.
How has technology changed the actual work of librarians? Are they spending their time doing different things?
I don't know, because I'm not in the library world as such, but one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about the hotspot lending and the digital realm, and maybe where librarians become more facilitators of network and learning and knowledge in a digital realm. If you think about all of the people now who are going to be networked digitally through their library cards, right? They're like, you've got a platform within the library space that allows people to potentially network to each other and to create knowledge and share knowledge and have that knowledge be curated across a library system. Very differently from what you've described in terms of the issues that come with books and digital forms of literature or reading that have to be curated. So if you create a platform where library card holders in the virtual space are coming together and saying, there's some transportation issues in the city that really need some solving, or some other sort of government services or neighborhood services, and you use the library as that platform, all of the people that have the library cards to come together and try to solve solution. The librarian can facilitate the coming together of that conversation. The library itself can maybe be a link to governments or other institutions as a way of that curating that conversation and lending itself to a solution that might be a technology solution or might be an analog solution.
Yeah, I would agree that I think one of the big changes in the role of the librarian is we're moving away from being the experts in finding stuff. Although there's certainly there's research librarians that are archivists and such, but more facilitators, and I think that's an interesting role and an evolving role that's important.
What about curation? Is that the job of the librarian more so than ever?
Curation in a traditional sense, no, I don't think so. I think curation in terms of curating program services that are relevant to their individual communities, yes.
Brian, when you were in San Francisco, you oversaw the design and construction of 24 new or renovated branch libraries when you were head of the branch of the neighborhood libraries in San Francisco. What are some of the key design challenges of the modern neighborhood library?
Well, one is flexibility. So as part of that program, we renovated beautiful Carnegie-era buildings, which are historic, and they're also a challenge to operate as the traditional as a library today. They have these sort of small little rooms, and they're not really laid out for the kind of flow that we would want in a library today. So one of the big things is just flexibility. And one of the things we know about libraries is that as the environment changes, so will the spaces. And so the main thing that we were thinking about throughout that is how we design for today's needs, but making sure that there was maximal flexibility. So there's a lot of things in our program that were around like raised flooring and that kind of stuff. But in Chicago, as we're looking at designing new libraries, we're increasingly looking at how we can design spaces that support a variety of different activities simultaneously. So for example, co-working is a big thing that we're looking at right now, is that many people who are using our libraries, particularly our central library and different libraries in the neighborhoods, are coming because they're a single person who's running their own business, and they're actually doing it out of the library. So how might we create a space that supports that activity? In addition to that, we have huge usage of young families and children. And so we're trying to figure out what's the best way to create spaces that support families and learning. And our traditional children's library was just sort of small furniture and small books and small shelves. And increasingly, we're looking at how we create an environment that really mimics what parents should be creating at home for their child in terms of encouraging creative play and designing spaces with those in mind. And so number one, it's flexibility. Number two, it's staying current with the leading trends of how what we learn about how people learn and designing spaces along with it.
It's interesting, just speaking to this last point, my daughter and my grandkids, they go to the park every morning. And when she was first started taking them, she used to hear the other mothers saying, "See you at the library," right? And she was also very curious as what's going on in the library that everybody else is going to. In her local library, they have the play space outside, and they have the play space inside, and they have all of these activities that are going on that are very family oriented. And same thing, it's not about little chairs and little books and somebody reading just to a group. It's really a place where it's an extension, I think, of the community that they have created, in the park, in the neighborhood, and so on. And it's become a very vibrant place for her to really spend time and learn about. In many ways, she's learning parenting. She's learning how the kids are learning how to network with each other or play with each other, and it's just something that she had never thought of in terms of what the library could provide.
One tiny example of this is in St. Paul. One of the libraries has set up a teen library space that's just off a basketball court, which I thought was a clever idea. And they're trying it out as an example of see if they can pull kids in through, I don't know, sweaty basketball game and come in and check out a book, see if it works.
Are the physical spaces of libraries, do they have different physical needs to provide digital services in your experience, John?
Well, I was director of a library at Harvard University, and it was a really big law library. It had this just most beautiful room you've ever seen. It was the size of a football field. My friend David Weinberger and I worked there. And what I was so interested in I would walk through the library at different times of the day, and that library is packed. Every single seat, for much of the time, particularly during exams, was covered in these long tables, and kids were arm by arm. And what was so interesting to me, in addition to it being so vibrant and a place that kids wanted to come and study, was that I never once, in 4 years of being a director there, saw a kid do this. Right? So the idea was not that they were there to take a book off a shelf. They were there because they had a laptop like David's, and they had a cup of coffee in the approved mug with the top on it, And it was a social space for doing this contemplative thing called studying. And were they there because the Wi-Fi was faster there than in their dorm or at home? I don't think particularly, right? And this was not an access issue. These are kids who have lots of ways to get access to the network. Were they there because there were portraits of dead white males in wigs that made them think of the law? I don't think that really was it. But there was something about coming to a common space. I think it was that there were human beings called librarians there, that if they were really in trouble, they could get access, and if they were having trouble. But they were all using either the big case books that they had been given and had highlighted, or they were using LexisNexis and these online services. So it's a long way of saying, I think the design challenge of spaces in a digital age for libraries is a really, really interesting one, and I think we should figure out where the digital and the physical kind of coalesce. But I think I think we might be overthinking it if we think, it's all about where the access points are. I think, as Brian said, it's about collaborative spaces. So we needed to create more rooms where, kids could actually work together in quiet as well as, in these open spaces. So I just think it may be simpler than we're thinking it is when we're imagining the redesign of these spaces. Boston Public Library, as an example, is going through a huge renovation right now of the historic Johnson building. And a lot of what they've been thinking about is they're putting the teens and the tweens up on the second floor in their kind of own spaces, and thinking that that might actually, you can make it attractive to them, but have them a little bit out of the way of of others, because they might make a little bit more noise there. Anyway, they're interesting thoughts like that actually don't have to do with the network, but might actually make a big difference in terms of usage.
Yeah. I want to go back to the point you made earlier about libraries, community center or not, and then what you just said. We work with a community center, a teen center, in the East Bay Area of San Francisco. And it's interesting, you walk into the teen center and the first thing you see is the library, actually. And so it is the library within the teen center, and it allows them to be who they are, what they're doing, and have access to the books, the videos, all of the library services that they would have if they went to the library, but it's actually there embedded in the space that they think of as their space, and so it's a wonderful thing. And we ask, it's and it's books, right? Because they have surrounding it all the other sort of digital things that they want to do, but they really wanted to create a space where the young people that are coming in to have those and talk about what they're reading and share what they're experiencing in relationship to the library. So maybe it's not just rebuilding or building new libraries, but it's moving the library, not like in a bookmobile, but moving the library into the spaces where people already gather.
I want to make sure we get some time for questions from the audience. So if you have questions for the panelists, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought around to you. Right here.
Hi, my name is Fred Kent. I'm with Project for Public Spaces. We work on libraries all over the world, or public spaces, and there's 3 quick examples. In Winnipeg, there's a whole bunch of African cultures coming into that city, different black African cultures, and they go to the library. And what they began to realize is that they needed to do more than just go to the library. So they put a market, an African market outside the library, and that really started, it was because the library was there, they were able to do that. Another librarian in Richmond, British Columbia, said he had to move out of his library into a large space that was kind of like a Walmart type space with other cultural institutions. And he said, we really served the community because they would come into the building and then they would find different places to go to, but it wasn't just the library that they would go to. They might go to some cultural activity. And then in Perth, Australia, the state librarian has a very big building. She decided to take all the library functions off of the ground floor, create a town square in a larger cultural center, and draw people in that way, but have various aspects of the library in that space, but other kinds of activity as well. And so Canadian librarians are really progressive about being in the communities. We're working on activating a Houston library, and the main library in Houston, with an activation event that Southwest Airlines is sponsoring. So there's all these ways where the library can become part of a town square. And maybe there's aspects of a community center in there, but there's so many other things that go on in the town square that libraries could be an integral part of and a major resource for.
Fred, was there a question there?
Well, the question is, I think you're talking about the library in a building, mostly. Except for you, I don't know your name, ma'am, but the future of libraries may be better to look at the building and its context within a community, and how all of these activities may go on with the library as a center of that. Mm-hmm. So that's a question.
Yes.
That was what I was trying to argue with the basketball court, putting it on the edge. I think there are lots of ways in which that's important.
But then the architecture of the future of libraries may be very different than it is in the past.
I think there was a question right up here. Yeah, right here.
I read about the bond problems in Chicago, the financial problems in Chicago and Illinois, and yet I don't hear that resonating through your commentary. Do you have a different way of being funded, or am I missing something?
Well, I didn't necessarily want to get into all the finances of Chicago, but I will. So, Chicago libraries, like any other, well, Chicago as a city has been struggling financially and hopefully is coming out of it. We at Chicago Public actually saw significant reductions in 2009 and in 2011 that resulted in reduction in hours. We have been able to bring many of those hours back, and part of the reason we've been able to do it was through restructuring and reorganizing, and also part of it was to help the mayor and help the city council see the important role that the library was playing in the city. The thing is about Chicago Public Library, just to give you a sense, I mean, it costs about $100 million to run the library. And that sounds like a big number, depending on the community that you're in. But when you look at what it costs to run the Chicago Public Schools, $6 billion, we're a tiny piece of a very expensive, large, sprawling city. And it turns out, at least in the view of city council and our mayor, in my view, is that tiny investment in libraries as these anchors, community, in neighborhoods, as well as playing a really important role in the after-school and out-of-school time learning, has been an effective argument for keeping funding in place. But it doesn't mean that we haven't experienced the economic downturn. I mean, one of the other challenges that we have on content is that our collections budget in Chicago is a little less than what we had in San Francisco, and we're 3 times the size. So we definitely have some financial challenges, and depending on what happens with pension reform in Chicago, they may be even deeper.
I think the key, in a way, though, is that you're a cheap date, Brian. The marginal cost of what really makes a difference in the library isn't such a big deal in the school system, right? Or whatever. I mean,
it's the 80-20.
Right, our high school costs $100 million to run, and you run the entire city of Chicago's system, public library system, right? There's much more margin and leverage in giving you another $6 million.
So, question right here.
I just came from the Rem Koolhaus Library in Seattle, and one of the biggest problems they have there is, and they see it as a problem, is the homelessness. They all gather within the library, and they are in the process right now of looking for answers to what do we do with this, because it's pervasive within all 6 floors. So one of the ideas they have, and I'd like to know if any of you have any new and innovative ideas, one of the ideas they have is to relegate a space with showers and bathrooms and washers and dryers and so forth within the library. What do you think about that, and do you have any new and updated ideas on that issue?
So, my thoughts on that, sort of similar to the high school question. I'm not totally sure that it's the role of the library to serve also as a shelter for homeless. I do think it's a really important question that libraries get, at least the ones that I've worked in. When you're in an urban setting, homelessness is part of the urban challenge, as is violence and so many other things. I do think it's important that we see libraries as public spaces that are open to all, regardless of who they are or their background. And that we don't start this sort of process of segregating and saying, well, we're going to create rules to highly discourage you from coming in and more encourage you. But one of the things I saw in San Francisco that we experimented with that was actually quite successful was actually bringing in people that would work with homeless to identify services outside the library that existed to support them. And so we brought in social workers, and that was their job. And so rather than trying to create a shelter within the library or segregate various different populations in different places of the library, it was a more connecting them to the services that already exist in the city. I think that's probably the approach that I would go towards. But every city looks at that in a different way.
There's a question back here. Can you get a microphone there?
Good morning. Brian, as you well know, there's a great deal of discussion and debate about where the Obama Library should go. And
Chicago.
Of course. I'm really just pointing to where in Chicago the Obama Library should go.
Well, we don't know that.
Exactly. But with that in mind, and just having been in Grand Rapids and visited the Ford Presidential Library, what do you guys think in general about how we can make these presidential libraries less a monument to an individual and more a way of engaging the populace around civic issues, citizenship, access, et cetera? What recommendations would you make to that committee about how the library should play out?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, I think presidential libraries, they're called libraries, and I think in some instances they perform as libraries. But I'm really excited by the prospect of wherever the Obama Library ends up, whether it's Chicago or somewhere else, that it really would aspire to something like what you just suggested, that it would be a place to learn about democracy, to engage in democracy, to see it in action. I think it would be great if that was happening in an urban space that you could actually see it live as opposed to sort of off in some remote place. We've actually been in discussions with all three of the institutions that are wanting to bring the Obama Library to Chicago about what role the public library might play in supporting those activities. And I think once the decision is made about where it goes, whether Chicago or somewhere else, and if it's in Chicago, that we hope to have a role in helping on that more public side of it. Because I agree it's a really important part of well, Obama's legacy, but also I think it's an important part of a presidential libraries and their mission.
I think here's an opportunity to think about, again, it's, when it would get started in terms of its, sort of building and design. It could be more of a digital, virtual library, presidential library. I mean, you think about, the uses of technology that the Obama administration has brought into, very stark relief, and its ability, hopefully, to sort of project into the future. And so, being a virtual library, in addition to having some, physical presence, and allowing for that discussion around democracy or the participation in democracy be more than just in one place, one city, but really sort of permeating across the U.S. because it is the President of the United States and not just Honolulu or Chicago or wherever they might decide to locate it.
I would argue strongly for this blended approach, particularly with this president, in the sense that I think his election initially was one of the times really in our history where somebody combined beautifully digital organizing with on the street, door knocking, right? In some respects, this hybrid thing is a big part of his legacy. I also have not talked about my pet project or many of our pet project, which is the Digital Public Library of America. This is an effort to create a national digital library. It has happened during Obama's presidency. Actually, two of the huge drivers of this have been the National Archives as well as the Smithsonian, which are big, obviously federal players. The National Archives oversees the presidential libraries, and David Ferriero, who's the Archivist of the United States, has been really the #1 champion of building this national digital library. And I actually could imagine a really cool statement that says, one of the things that happened during the president's tenure was to create this national platform for libraries digitally, and also really connect it to a space in his hometown of Chicago. And I think you could do something really incredibly cool that speaks to the future of libraries as platforms and as places in a meaningful way. I think it's like tailor-built for that.
It's got to be Chicago. Right?
Got to be Chicago. Yeah. But got to have a digital.
I think we have time for one
too.
last question. How about right here? You want a microphone here?
In these times with still tight budgets and tough decisions about what content to buy and in what format, I'm wondering how patron-driven acquisition programs and other data that libraries now have is being used to tailor the acquisition programs. To what extent? And how is that information being used to push back to publishers about what to publish and how to price it and how to make it available?
Yeah, so there's two. So I'll start with that one. So patron-driven acquisitions, for those of you who are not librarians in the room, I suspect no, you're not? A publisher is a way basically for us to buy when a patron asks for it, as opposed to thinking that there'll be demand and then doing a bunch of mass purchasing. So definitely, the patron-driven acquisition, floating collections, a variety of ways that we're looking at how we can more efficiently use that resource. I actually think that's one of the silver linings of a reduced budget, is that it makes you become much more creative about the resources that you have. The question around publishers is it's a tough question. I mean, each library on their own doesn't have the negotiating power that a library as a collective has. but libraries as collectives all have various different views, and there's some libraries, I'm not going to name them, that will go off and work with publishers separately and negotiate something for their own city, but it doesn't extend to all cities. So I think it's a great challenge to libraries to be more collaborative in how we work with publishers. At the end of the day, we want to make the information available. We also want publishers to be successful in their business model. So I think there's a way to do both. We just haven't gotten there yet.
We haven't talked that much about libraries' roles as creating the long-term preservation of knowledge, and we've talked mostly about access, which is natural since we're talking about public libraries, but I think we need to keep both in mind, which is the role of providing access and the role of preservation. And actually this question I think really drives at it, which is if all you did as libraries were to provide exactly what everybody thinks they want at that moment and didn't think about this sort of keeper of knowledge role, and maybe this idea of serendipity, that you would present somebody a book they didn't think they knew they wanted and they happened to see it on a shelf and they were to take it. So I just think as we go forward, I think patron-driven acquisition is a really interesting idea and a good one in some respects. I think libraries and publishers need to make common cause to get through this transitional period, and I actually think there is a collective action issue there that could be interesting. But at the same time, I think we have to just recall that many publishers go out of business, and as a library director, I was shocked by 3 or 4 times in 4 years, publishers came to me and said, you have copies of things that we own the rights to, but we don't literally have them. We need copies of them back so we can make digital copies. 3 or 4 times, major publishers, who had eventually acquired them. The other thing is that, the digital library, or the Library of Alexandria doesn't exist, right? The Library of Pergamon doesn't exist anymore. The grand libraries of the world, they get destroyed somehow. We actually need a system that ensures that in this digital era, we're actually preserving all this knowledge as well as making it available.
This is where you go a little bit down that slippery slope I mentioned about the marketplace of the future being driven by the analytics of consumers, the documentation of consumers' tastes, and such, deciding what products get brought to the market. And there is a need for sort of a human element, in all of that, so that it doesn't just become about algorithm.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and have a great day. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.